Let's talk about something that completely flips the script when it comes to avoidant attachment. The fact that avoidants don't actually miss you until you fully let go. And I mean fully, not halfway. Not, I'm pretending to move on, but I'm still secretly hoping they'll come back. I'm talking about the moment when your energy, your emotional investment, is no longer accessible to them. That's when the avoidant suddenly feels the loss and it catches them off guard. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive because everything in our cultural conditioning tells us that if someone misses you, they'll show it right away. They'll feel your absence the moment you're gone, right? But avoidants don't function that way. In fact, they are wired psychologically and neurologically to not feel their feelings in real time. They detach not just from you, but from themselves. That's how they survive intimacy. That's how they cope. So when you walk away from someone with an avoidant attachment style, you're not going to get that immediate emotional response. You'll probably get silence or a sense of indifference. They might even look relieved. And that's where most people panic. They think, wow, I must not have meant anything to them. And they go right back into chasing, texting, checking in, trying to reignite something that was never fully engaged to begin with. But here's the truth: your presence was never the issue. It was their capacity to tolerate closeness that was underdeveloped. Avoidants crave connection on a subconscious level, but the moment it becomes real, they experience it as a threat. Not because you're threatening, but because closeness challenges their core emotional defenses. It pulls at the threads of unresolved wounds they've spent their entire lives avoiding. That's why they're called avoidant. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Once you stop reaching out, once you stop waiting for them to realize your worth, or trying to explain your value, or even hoping they'll change, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop feeding the dynamic. You withdraw your emotional currency. And that's when the avoidant starts to feel something they didn't expect: absence. But it's not your physical absence they notice first. It's the absence of your emotional availability. The calls that no longer come. The messages that aren't being sent. The subtle yet unmistakable shift in your energy. And for someone who has built their identity around controlling how much they let people in, this shift becomes disorienting. Why? Because for the first time, they're not in control of the emotional distance. You are. At this point, many avoidants will experience what psychologists refer to as an activation hangover. That's the emotional aftermath of detaching from someone they actually cared about, but were too defended to admit it. When your attention is no longer a given, it creates a space internally for the feelings they've been avoiding to emerge. Guilt, regret, nostalgia, even longing. But it's not necessarily because they've become emotionally mature overnight. It's because your absence has become a mirror. And that mirror reflects back something they can't ignore: the reality that you are no longer orbiting around them. Let me be clear, this is not a tactic. This is not about playing hard to get or using emotional distance as a strategy to get someone to chase you. That's manipulation, and avoidants are very sensitive to anything that smells like control. What I'm talking about is authentic detachment. Reclaiming your energy, reclaiming your self-respect, not as a way to trigger their response, but as a way to heal yours. Because when you let go for real, when you stop giving, stop hoping, stop waiting, you create an energetic boundary. And that boundary sends a clear message: I'm no longer available to be half loved. That's the message avoidants hear loud and clear, even if it takes them weeks, months, or sometimes longer to consciously process it. The irony is that the moment you stop needing them to come back is the moment they start wondering where you went. That's not because they've suddenly become emotionally generous. It's because the dynamic that kept them feeling safe is gone. And now they have to sit with the uncomfortable question. Did I lose something valuable? That question alone can trigger a wave of delayed emotional awareness. But that awareness, while real, doesn't always come with changed behavior. That's something you need to remember. Just because someone starts missing you doesn't mean they're ready to meet you where you are. Just because they realize your absence doesn't mean they're capable of holding your presence. So don't fall for breadcrumbs of attention. Don't confuse emotional discomfort on their part with emotional readiness. Instead, use that moment, the moment they start missing you, as a mirror for yourself. Reflect on how far you've come, how deeply you've healed, and how much more you now require from any connection you allow back into your life. Because ultimately, missing you is not the same as valuing you. And that's the difference that changes everything. Let's talk about the psychology behind space, emotional distance, and why avoidants tend to reconnect only after you've created it. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. It's easy to think that closeness breeds connection, that if you just get through to them, stay present, stay loving, stay patient, they'll finally soften. They'll finally choose intimacy. But that's not how avoidants work. In fact, the more emotionally close you get, the more emotionally unsafe they feel. It sounds paradoxical. To most people, love equals closeness. But for someone with an avoidant attachment pattern, love often equals vulnerability, and vulnerability equals danger. So when the relationship is active, when you're reaching out, when you're trying to have those deep conversations, or even just maintain closeness, they're internally withdrawing. Not because they don't care. Not because you've done something wrong. But because their nervous system is wired to interpret intimacy as a threat. And here's where it gets really nuanced. When you finally step away, when you stop reaching out, stop managing the emotional weight of the relationship for both of you, that's when they start to feel something unexpected, relief. Not the kind of relief you feel after escaping something toxic, but a nervous system level calm. You're no longer emotionally too close, and that gives them space. And that space, that's their version of emotional safety. But here's the catch. It's in that very space, that very silence, where something starts to shift inside of them. At first, it might just be a sense of peace, a break from emotional pressure. But then that silence lingers. The noise of everyday life starts to fade. The distractions stop working. And with time, their internal narrative begins to change. Without the emotional closeness triggering their defense mechanisms, they begin to feel things they couldn't access before. You see, avoidants don't reflect well under pressure. They don't introspect deeply when they feel emotionally cornered. That's why trying to talk it out in the heat of conflict rarely leads to a breakthrough with them. They need distance to reflect, not because they're more rational or emotionally cold, but because their system is designed to self-protect through detachment. And only when that perceived threat of closeness is removed do they have the capacity to sit with the truth of their own experience. So what happens in that quiet space you leave behind? They start remembering things differently. Not necessarily accurately, but emotionally. They remember the warmth, the stability, the comfort, the laughter, the moments you were there for them without asking for anything in return. But this time, those memories aren't filtered through the lens of emotional overwhelm. They're filtered through absence. And absence has a way of highlighting value. What used to feel like pressure now starts to look like care. What used to feel like suffocation begins to look like intimacy. And what used to make them retreat now makes them wonder. What if I misunderstood what I had? But again, and I can't stress this enough, this reflection doesn't happen while you're still emotionally available. It happens after you've left the space. It happens when the noise has stopped, when your emotional energy is no longer soothing or regulating their world. That's when they're left with themselves, and that's when the real emotional reckoning begins. Now, does this mean they're ready to come back and love you better? Not necessarily. Emotional reflection doesn't equal emotional transformation. But what it does mean is that the very thing you were afraid to do, pull back, let go, stop managing the relationship, is often the only thing that creates the psychological conditions for them to even begin processing what they lost. You giving them space isn't abandonment. It's clarity. You're allowing both of you to step out of the reactive loop. You're choosing emotional honesty over emotional chasing. And more importantly, you're allowing yourself to see who they become when they're no longer regulated by your presence. If they grow, great. If they don't, that's clarity too. Because here's the deeper truth. You can't teach someone to value connection by constantly offering it. Sometimes they have to feel the silence. Sometimes they have to sit in the space where your voice used to be. Your energy, your care, your presence, it can't be truly recognized until it's no longer taken for granted. So if you're wondering why they only start reflecting after you let go, this is why distance is not the opposite of intimacy for the avoidant. It's the precondition for their emotional processing. It's the only state where their defenses quiet down enough for the truth to land. And if you're the one who's always bridged the gap, who's always closed the space when it felt uncomfortable, maybe it's time to stop, because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone who fears closeness is to finally give them the distance they need to feel what they've been running from. And that's not rejection, that's self-respect. Let's get into something that most people completely overlook when they're dealing with avoidant behavior. The fact that avoidants, even though they fear closeness, also carry a deep, often unacknowledged fear of abandonment. I know, that sounds contradictory. How can someone fear intimacy and abandonment at the same time? It seems impossible, right? But this is where it gets psychologically rich, and where most people misread the situation entirely. Avoidants aren't emotionally indifferent. They're emotionally defended. That's a big difference. These are people who, at some point in their early emotional development, learned that being vulnerable was either unsafe or unrewarded. So they built a protective shell. They learned to suppress their emotional needs, to rely on themselves, and to view closeness as risky. But here's the twist. Just because they don't show their emotional needs doesn't mean they don't have them. Underneath the mask of indifference, avoidants carry a lot of the same core wounds as people with anxious attachment, wounds around worthiness, security, and fear of being left. The difference is, while anxious types cling when they feel insecure, avoidants detach. They act like they don't care. They create space. They shut down. Not because they feel nothing, but because that's how they cope with feeling too much. They disconnect